Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ideas Factory. I am Naghma, with me is Professor Pant. A lot has been happening around the world, and this week has been quite interesting, beginning with the United States, where Kamala Harris formally accepted the Democratic Party's nomination for vice president, and in doing so, she made history, being the first Indian Black American woman to do so. Biden's convention address has been a big success, has been projected as a huge success, even by some of the Republican critics or Republican pundits. And he may have, in the process, he may have won over some converts, it is said. Along with that, India is stepping up curbs on Chinese activity. There is extra scrutiny for visa, reviewing Beijing's links with local universities, and the exposure to the vulnerable sectors, to Chinese activities who influence the think tanks, the academics, all that has been happening. And most interestingly, Pakistan. We will also look at Pakistan's relations vis-a-vis its long-time ally, Saudi Arabia, and its new friends like Turkey and Malaysia, and along with that, the new terror list that has come out in Pakistan, where for the first time, India's most wanted, Dawood Ibrahim's name also appears, and there is an acceptance that Dawood Ibrahim's address is in Karachi. So welcome to this episode. Harsh, I would like to begin with Pakistan and its acceptance that Dawood Ibrahim does live in White House, which is in the Clifton area in Karachi, near the Saudi mosque. Now, we know that there is pressure. Pakistan is already in the grey list by FATF, and it wants to avoid getting into the blacklist. So we see time and again, Pakistan tries to project that it is getting serious over controlling terrorism. There is always the option of denial. But right now, naming Dawood Ibrahim, do you see any kind of significant change in Pakistan's attitude? And how would you look at this?
Well, I think there is a sense, Naghma, of deja vu. You know, we've been there, done that. There are times when Pakistan has taken so many U-turns on this question of terrorism and extremism that you I think its global interlocutors, and in particular India, seems to have become immune to them in some ways. Yes, we have seen this first-time disclosure, acknowledgement at least, that Dawood Ibrahim remains there. Dawood Ibrahim has had some presence there, something that they've been denying quite insistently over the last few decades. But the question is, there is clearly the issue of FATF that is bothering Pakistan, and there is a clear recognition that global censure of Pakistan has gone to an extent where it is almost impossible to Pakistan to deny some of these things or to get away with it. So I think we have seen this list come out at a time when perhaps it wants to avoid some of that pressure entering into the blacklist of FATF. But my sense is that nothing material is going to change on the ground, because the positions, of course, you have Pakistan themselves have been saying that, oh, it doesn't mean much because this is something that we are just acknowledging. The visas, passports have not been issued by us. The documents are not Pakistani issued. They are, they term it misused, the term that they use. So clearly, I think from their perspective, the idea is that, look, we are just putting it out in the public domain, but we don't want to acknowledge our complicity. And I think that's where the real issue is. That unless Pakistani policymakers start looking at this issue of terrorism as one, or extremism, promotion of this as an instrument of a state policy as one which has not only harmed Pakistan's neighbors but also Pakistan itself. If Pakistan, if Pakistani policymakers were doing some introspection, they would find that this systematic, denial of this policy has led to a situation where there are very few friends left in the world, and the pressure that is piling on them is becoming, significant enough for them to make a declaration like this. Now, in the past, we have seen these U-turns coming back. We have seen individuals also being put behind the bars and then released shamefacedly. So I think we don't really know where this would go. But I think certainly it's an important step from India's perspective, something that India has been claiming for so long and Pakistan was denying, although I very much doubt that the rest of the world was buying into that narrative.
Absolutely, but at least, and even now, it is said that there is always that room of denial or saying that we're just acknowledging it. But nevertheless, the acceptance, and like you said, that very few friends left. Do we see that we see that the two allies, old allies, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, are also drifting apart? We all know the statement Foreign Minister Qureshi made, after which Bajwa, the army chief, had to rush to Saudi Arabia. But when he goes to Saudi Arabia, he was snubbed by the Saudi crown prince, who did not even meet him. The defense minister met him and he had to come back. But after he comes back, there was again, immediately Qureshi rushes to China. So Pakistan is also looking at new friends, but at the same time, Saudi Arabia, which has been probably one of the biggest creditors to Pakistan, who's been giving loans and who now wants Pakistan to pay back some of those. Saudi Arabia is clearly not happy with the way Pakistan is going. Where is Pakistan trying to position itself? Because we see that it is also trying to get close to Turkey and Malaysia, its new friends, because Turkey is emerging as the third factor in this the fight over who's controlling the Islamic world.
It's quite curious. I think, Pakistan's problem is that it doesn't have a foreign policy. It has an India policy around which everything else, it tries to frame everything else. So clearly, I think this lack of recognition that the world is changing beyond recognition, that even the Middle East, something, this simplistic assumption that we are all Islamic countries and therefore all Islamic countries will take our side when it comes to geostrategic positioning, when it comes to issues like Kashmir. Now, there is a lot of frustration in Pakistan that nothing much has happened since last year when Article 370 was revoked and the Islamic world has not really mobilized, perhaps to an extent that Pakistan would have wanted. But there are good reasons for that. The world has evolved. India has evolved. India's relationships with Middle Eastern countries, West Asian countries have evolved. And Saudis and countries like UAE are positioning themselves differently. The whole geopolitics and geoeconomics of the Middle East has changed completely in the last decade. Now, for Pakistan not to acknowledge that and for Pakistan not to keep on reviving or evolving its foreign policy, given the changing realities around it, I think has created this big problem that Pakistan now finds itself isolated. So you have a situation where Saudis do not want to be friends with Pakistan to an extent they were at one particular point in time, because Saudis themselves are evolving their policies. Now, Saudis' relations with India today are completely transformed. I mean, they are based on their recognition that they need to modernize their economy. They need countries like India to modernize that economy. They need countries like India to have a robust economic and trade relationship, and therefore not looking at the relationship primarily through the Islamic prism. They would have had, some concerns in the past, but today they want to be more pragmatic about it. Now, also Pakistan is tying itself in knots about it.
Sure. Sure. Harsh, I just wanted to add it also because we see that there is a change too in Saudi Arabia with the new order taking over. MBS or Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, is very proactive and he is taking decisions, and a lot is changing in Saudi Arabia, and which is why we also see that Saudi Arabia is preferring to build ties with India rather than criticize it over Kashmir. Even earlier after Pulwama, when he visited here, it did not really wade into the Kashmir issue as Pakistan would have liked it to. So do you also see this as a change and the new order coming in Saudi Arabia? We've just seen the UAE and Israel pact deal that has happened, which is also historic in nature. It will change the Arab-Israel relationship. And Saudi Arabia clearly is India has also tried to woo the Arab world over the last 6 years a lot with high-level delegation meetings. All that has been happening. So we see the relationship changing totally, like you rightly said. Economy is important. Change is important.
Yes, I think the whole this assumption that your interests remain static is a fundamentally flawed assumption. Your interests evolve as the realities on the ground evolve. And I think for Saudis, for UAE, for Islamic countries in the Middle East, there is a new reality that is facing them, that the geoeconomics of oil is getting transformed. So you have to modernize your economy. You have to make your economies in sync with 21st century requirements. Otherwise, it's going to be a very downhill trajectory. And I think, to the credit of Middle Eastern politicians, they are recognizing the challenge. They are evolving it in a direction that perhaps might pay them dividends in the coming decades and coming years. And of course, you see the larger reality where America is no longer the most important player in the Middle East. So you do see that the challenge that, you have to change gears, you have to approach new partners, and the way the geopolitics is evolving in directions where a few would have imagined the kind of deal that UAE and Israel have come across. Now, it is interesting that Pakistan refuses to acknowledge that. They refuse to change in some ways fundamentally. And that I think is creating these problems where instead of now reconciling to the fact that a large part of the Arab world would potentially reconcile to Israel's existence in the region and would therefore find a modus vivendi to deal with Israel. Pakistan has now said, all right, no, we are going to be this guarantor of the Islamic world, and we are going to take on Israel, as if they have the capacity. Now, I think what is also happening is there is a new fault line. So you have countries like Turkey and Malaysia who seems to be more vocal about they being the guarantors of the Islamic world, and therefore trying to take on the mantle of a country like Saudi Arabia, for example. So you have a lot of that happening within the Islamic world. And therefore, I think for Pakistan to conveniently now think that it can shift from the Saudi camp to the Turkish camp, partly and only because of the India factor. Only because India is something that, the old paradigm of Indian foreign, of how they relate their foreign policy and every aspect of the foreign policy vis-a-vis India, they now want to shift gears. Now, that's not going to come without its costs. That's going to be extremely costly for them, as they're recognizing. So, the trips that you were talking about, how they have tied themselves into knots with the military, with the army chief, and then their foreign minister, both of them trying to reconcile to this new reality. Now, of course, China will play an important role. But China, if we know China at all, we know one thing, that they always want returns on their investment. They are not going to put money in a black hole, and which something that I think Pakistanis have relied in the past. You have the Saudi money and the American money that had come and without any results. So I think we are in for some very strange times in the Pakistani foreign policy era, because Pakistan's inability to reconcile to this reality that India today is in a different league. When you have an economy that is smaller than the economy of a city of Mumbai, you cannot think that there is a parity between India and Pakistan. And I think that fundamental acknowledgement is not coming. That fundamental reality is not sinking in. And that leads them into all sorts of foreign policy adventures, which I don't think are going to pay them any dividends.
Absolutely. And like you said, refusal to change and to accept that things are changing, like we see in West Asia or at the Middle East. And when you talk of how US is not really the most important player now in West Asia, very quick comment on the Russian and Chinese interests in West Asia. How is that playing out?
Absolutely. I think, you have new players today. So Russia, China at one point, were competitors. Today, they seem to be working more in tandem in several parts of the world. Now, in Middle East also, we have seen how increasingly and some would say very proactively, some would say very adventurously, Russia has played its cards with certain actors who have been able to take on Western interests in the region. So you have multiple major global players who are coming into the fray and complicating an already very complicated landscape in West Asia. And I think that jostling for influence that is emerging out of this will have some very significant, or is already having very significant consequences. And therefore, for any country not to acknowledge that change and therefore continue to rely on the old paradigm would not be paying dividends. Now, China's role, of course, we know is going to be very critical, given how important China is for the Middle East today, and how most of the countries in the region acknowledge Chinese presence and have tried to have very good relations with China. Similarly, with India, if you see, yes, India, for example, recently has had some setbacks for, in the Chabahar case with Iran. But largely, if you see, India has also been able to maintain its ties with Iran, with the Arab Gulf states, with Israel. So clearly, the paradigm is shifting. When you see UAE and Israel having a pact, and UAE and Israel are two of the most important West Asian countries for India, are two most important partners in India. Now, clearly, this is something that that Pakistan would find unable to reconcile with. And therefore, now there are talks of even Saudis would go and try to have a relationship with Israel potentially, and there are already back channel negotiations going on. Now, this is a completely transformative moment in Middle Eastern politics, if and game-changing moment. And therefore, for India is well positioned. But I think the question that countries like Pakistan will have to answer is that whether the old paradigm is working for them, and if not, then what can be changed? Unfortunately, if you, as an observer, if you're looking at it, you cannot be very optimistic about that change, because Pakistan's identity question is tied with the India question. So therefore, that policy, they would find it very difficult to at least acknowledge that they need to change.
True. And like you said, there is hardly any foreign policy but an India policy. When we talk of China, China too is facing a new reality. We see there is a pushback from many countries. We discussed in our previous episode how America is now very, very careful and vigilant about the Confucius institutes too, and it's trying to monitor how much Chinese influence is actually coming in terms of through these institutes and influencing people, influencing ideas and students. We've seen similar actions elsewhere, and now India too is stepping up curbs on Chinese activity more and more after the ban on apps, like the TikTok or the Weibo, and so now where there is extra scrutiny for visa, then there is a reviewing of links with local university, Beijing's links, a lot of universities which have direct MOU, which have exchanges, or where the vulnerable sectors were exposed to Chinese influence, the academics, the think tanks, all that is going to be monitored very, very strictly. Now, do you think, of course, there would be retaliation. So do you think New Delhi is already assessing the ramifications in terms of potential retaliation from Beijing? And then will India, or does India have the ability to withstand that?
I think there are some, there are some areas where potentially we can, and I think the assessment seems to be that we should stand up to China. So you see an across the domain effort here, where not only trade and economics and technology are under scanner, but as you pointed out, we are also looking at cultural exchanges. We are also looking at academic exchanges. Now, in some ways, it is very sad to see that the world is returning to a phase where even academic exchanges are becoming problematic. This is something that not only India is doing, but across the world it is happening. Countries are getting very, very suspicious of what is happening in the garb of academic exchanges, cultural exchanges, what China is doing in terms of propagating its geopolitical interests. And that is, I think, for a world order, for an international community that at least in theory should rely on greater such exchanges to evolve a greater understanding of each other's culture and academia is at a tipping point in some ways. And I think when you have academia under a scanner, you know that something is fundamentally wrong. Now, I think, but the assessment seems to be that there is no other option, because the Chinese have put their stamp on these measures, or Chinese Communist Party has put a stamp on these measures to an extent where it is now becoming impossible to ignore it. At one point, you could have said, all right, these are just students, who are coming for, for the larger knowledge purposes. And so let's establish these links. Let's enhance these links. Today, you are looking at all of these links with a degree of suspicion. And that was simply not there in the past. And I think that changes the calculus for Chinese academic institutions, for Chinese students, and that changes the calculus for those who are receiving these institutes and students. And I think, that's, of course, raises the costs. It raises the possibility that greater misunderstandings would happen in the future. But I think Chinese own actions have led us to this point where, or Chinese Communist Party's own actions have led us to this point where an ordinary Chinese today would be looked at with suspicion. That, what is he doing, if he's an academic? Why is he coming to my country? I mean, this is a very sad state of affairs. But I think, unfortunately, by wielding even academia as a weapon, as a geopolitical weapon, China has created this, environment of suspicion that I think it would take decades for us to recover from. After one thought that perhaps post-Cold War, we are living in a world where these things would become normalized. But again, we are back to square one. And when people now talk of Cold War 2.0, there's a real possibility that I think the first casualty of that Cold War, yes, of course, trade will suffer, technology exchanges will suffer, but I think at the fundamental level, people to people contacts, academic exchanges, cultural exchanges, which something we have been taking for granted now for in the post Cold War world, have become a casualty.
And that's very, very sad. That, I mean, along with trade, which will become casualty and which will change or is changing, the cultural exchanges, academia, and being under scanner, all that is a new reality that we are now faced with, because China has been using these universities and even students as weapons of for its propaganda. And increasingly, every other country is realizing that if we can just move on to the United States and see and analyze history being made there. Kamala Harris, of course, her story is a true American story. But other than that, how would you analyze Biden's Democratic Convention address? Because it was fantastic. It probably has won over some converts. So do you see that there is a change now in way things were looking in the US election?
Yes, I think Mr. Biden has been able to generate a sense of enthusiasm about his candidacy with Ms. Harris's nomination and with the convention that perhaps was missing before. But I think it is also important to recognize that post conventions, it's always a bounce that you get. So, because you are covered 24/7 by the media for 3 to 4 days. So generally, candidates get a bounce. I'm sure Mr. Trump will also get a bounce after his Republican convention in September, early September. But my sense is that I think it's still a bit early to say whether the polls, especially in battleground states, would remain what they are today. As of now, they look very good for Mr. Trump, for Mr. Biden. And I think what he has been able to do is basically not generate or not done any goof ups. He is prone to gaffes, and I think where he has been successful in his speech, in his convention, is that it has been a convention which has been about bringing people together. He has been able to get his message out. That there has been a lot of divisive politics of Mr. Trump's era, and now I'm the one who's bringing everyone together. I think that is something that perhaps will resonate with a lot of Americans because of what has been going on in the country. But whether that is enough in the battleground states, which still remain very polarized, I think we will know post Republican convention, and we will know post the bounce has settled. But clearly, I think he has been able to reconcile, at least within the Democrats, both on the extreme left, so-called progressive lefts, and the centrists. So I think that was the fundamental division. That has been a fundamental division in the party. He seems to have given this message that all the Democrats and all the constituencies that support the Democrats are together in supporting his nomination, and his speech was therefore aimed at doing that. And I think that message has gone out, and he will now need to sustain that message over the next few weeks as he goes into the final stages of the elections.
And you try to give out the message that he is there for all the Americans, irrespective of them being Democrats or Republicans. So at least Trump's efforts to portray Biden as a radical leftist fell flat, at least during these conventions. And we have to see how things change or how things shape up. So thank you so much, Harsh, for all that analysis for this week. That's it from us.